Hello, my name is Ben and I am a web developer based in the UK. Before becoming a developer, though, I worked as a journalist for the best part of 7 years, and as you can imagine, I wrote a lot every day. Now, we're in January as I'm recording this, and one of the things that I've seen a lot of my developer friends tweeting about on Twitter is that they would like to blog more. So, bearing in mind my previous experience, what I thought would be quite interesting is to share some tips and tricks that I learned during that time and basically see if we can help anyone. So, what I thought I would do is look at one of the blog posts that I want to write. And that blog post is how to set up a tool that I've been using a lot lately, which is Tailwind CSS. Now, I asked on Twitter the other day whether people had any recommendations or requests for tutorials, and setting up Tailwind came up quite a few times. So I figured it's at the beginning, it's kind of a necessity for you to be able to really go into more detail. Why not do that as the first thing? So rather than just sort of write this up, what I thought would be quite interesting is to give you an insight into how I will go about writing this. So the first things first, what you kind of need to do, I'm just going to move this window out of the way, is to have a bit of a notepad open. It doesn't matter what tool you want to use. I'm just trying out Ulysses to see what it's like, but I've worked with Byword, I've worked with Bear, a number of different tools. It's whatever suits you. The key thing is just to have a notepad open. Now, one thing that is quite intimidating for a lot of people is a blank page. Everybody doesn't like it. Even experienced journalists don't particularly like opening up a blank page. So sometimes what I find is quite useful is just to effectively start writing something rather than necessarily leaving it a blank page. So what we'll do is we'll just add the title or a rough title of what we are going to be writing about. Now, you don't need to get the title right the first time. You can come back and tweak it, but because this blog post is going to be about setting up Tailwind CSS, let's just call it Setting Up Tailwind CSS. So one of the key things that we want to try and do is break down this blog into as smaller chunks as possible. Ideally, I found that breaking it down to sections and then breaking down those sections to bullet points, and those bullet points being representative of no more really than 100, 150 words is a really great way of finding a flow and being able to get around writer's block. So obviously, bearing in mind this, we need to have a think about what the structure of this blog post is going to be. And because it's going to be a tutorial, it makes sense to try and break it down into its key parts. So being a tutorial and the chance that somebody might come across this without necessarily knowing what Tailwind is, we probably want to start off with a very quick thing of what is Tailwind CSS, okay? And rather than go back into that particular point and start adding bullet points, we won't do that right now. What we'll do is we'll skip on to the next section. So bearing in mind that we are going to be doing this, it probably pays to just pay a tiny bit of attention to server environments. What I mean by that is development or developing locally. We'll break the rule just very, very small. What is a local server? Or not even what is a local server actually. And note that you'll need a local server. I'm using Laravel Valet. You can use other tools. And that's it. That's all we just need for that type of thing at the moment. We can come back to that later on. Next section is the actual first step. So we need to create a folder that our website will live in. Now, I'm not going to go any more than that. Once we've done that, we need to open code editor. Now, this step is interchangeable. It might be that I move this around. Typically, I personally would create the folder via the terminal, but that is not necessarily to say that that is the way that most people do it. And when you're writing a tutorial like this, it usually pays to try and do it in a way that the majority of people are going to understand. So that might be something that we change later on. Step 3 is we need to create an index.html file. So obviously any website requires an index.html file, to basically allow the browser to know where it's looking. I'm going to keep it as a HTML file rather than a PHP file, just because I think Tailwind is not a PHP language. It could be used on a Python site. It could be used on a Rails site. So I want to try and keep it as simple as possible so that anybody, irrespective of the tool, the language, or the framework that they're using, can look at this and work it out. It also means I don't have to create 15 different articles that are vaguely similar. So we've got to create an index.html file. The next thing that we want to do will be to set up our package manager, because unfortunately Tailwind does require a package manager in order to compile it. Step 5 will be in fact, let's just quickly go in here and we're just going to create a separate one. I'm going to go 4.1 and npm versus Yarn. Now, I typically use Yarn, so it's a case of me just being able to sort of mention that and say that you can use npm, maybe work out whether or not I'm going to give people 2 sets of instructions. I don't know, we'll see. So once we've done npm yarn, we then need to install Tailwind, and also, in fact, that's probably going to be 4.3, because 4.2 will be the build tool. So I am going to use Laravel Mix because this is what I'm using at the moment. Maybe give some instructions or examples for other tools, i.e. Gulp. And quite often I'll just make notes like this while I'm going through, just to try and give me some talking points later on. And then, because we're using Laravel Mix, we need to install Laravel Mix. And then what we're going to do is we are going to 4.5, in fact actually that's more part of that. So we will write some npm yarn scripts to run our build process, run our business. It'd be pretty impressive if it could. Run our build processes. Now, once we've done that, we need to test that. In fact, not a test. We would be that's a very good question. What would the next step be? We will, well, in theory, it should be working. Again, that's a great example of me writing a title that is not necessarily intended to be the final title, but just more of a thing, note for me to say, is this working? Is this where we wrap up the blog post? And I think it's also quite good to know where the ending is when we're going to actually do this, because sometimes it can be quite easy to run off and waffle far longer than you actually need to. So let's come back to this point. So when we create a folder, I'm going to do it via the command line. You could do this via a GUI. Nothing wrong there. And then I'm going to cd Right, there's ulysses being interesting. Not what I wanted to. Not what I wanted. Oh. Oops. CD into the folder name, and let's just see if we do that. There we go. That's what we're after. Apparently you can't type it before you've got to type out what you're actually going to do. What are we going to call it? Because that kind of makes sense if we actually know what we're going to call it before we actually do it. Let's say Tailwind CSS demo. Yeah? And then what we can do is, if we move it up here, because it makes more sense to define it there, we are going to cd into Tailwind CSS demo. Now we're creating the folder, but one thing to think about is that we need to define where we're going to be in. So I'm going to navigate to where my sites folder lives, which is cd user and sites. Now that's just, like I said, for me, that's where mine lives. Obviously I need to talk about, sort of where yours will live. Hopefully the type of people who are using this tutorial will have an idea about where they are. And of course, the great thing about working digitally is if people are unclear, we can always come back and we can always add additional information to it if we're getting feedback that it's not that simple to follow. So we've now created a folder, going to do it via command line. So I'm going to navigate to where my sites folder lives. What we're going to call it, let's say Tailwind CSS demo. Could do it via GUI, nothing wrong here. And then we're going to cd into that. Now this is where I use VS Code. I have a terminal command to open the current folder. You could also open it from within your code editor of choice, or even drag the folder onto the icon if you're using a Mac. Always good to have a couple of options. So we'll open up the code editor, and in theory that is pretty much that step done. Obviously we might need to write a little bit more when we actually come to do it, but we can tackle that when it comes to it. So I also use Emmet, so I can simply type HTML5 and tab, and it will auto fill out a basic HTML structure. I know some people use HTML5 boilerplate, so you could also use something like HTML5 boilerplate if you'd prefer. Entirely up to you. Now, what we also going to do here is we're going to create a link in the header to a CSS file that doesn't exist yet. Now, when I create CSS files and when I do my projects, I like to keep my CSS in a folder, i.e. CSS app.css. Same goes for JavaScript, even though that's not part of scope of tutorial. I.e. JS app.css. You can call this whatever you like. I just like the word app. It's always worth bearing in mind that sometimes the type of people who will be viewing your tutorial are not 100% confident with their development. So sometimes they'll see like, oh, people calling it app or people calling it main, I've got to call it that. It's personal preference. You could call it whatever you wanted. It's just literally whatever makes sense to you and you're comfortable with. App is a 3-letter word. It's descriptive. So, I just typically use that. What we are going to do is we are going to call that whatever. And then let's create some dummy content. So create a section code with a h1 p tag and maybe a button. Yeah, it'd be probably good to do that type of thing. And that's going to be our demo. That's going to be what we use to make it clear that it's working. And then so that's pretty much everything that we need to kind of talk about with that. Set up our package manager. I use Yarn. This demo will use Yarn. You can use npm if you want. Personal preference. Commands are interchangeable, i.e. Okay, right. There we go. So if you do that on a new line in Ulysses, it seems to throw a hissy fit. So we need to type something before we open up a code tag on this. So yarn add package name d is the same as npm, not nom. Although, to be fair, I'm surprised nobody has created a tool like that. Package name and save dev. Let's just undo that because we don't want it to shortcut that. Okay, so yarn add package name.d is the same as npm iPackage thingy. Yeah, that's all fine. Build tool. I'm going to use Laravel Mix. Intro to what Laravel Mix is. Built by Jeffrey Way of Laracas fame. Don't need to be using Laravel to use it. It came out of that community. In fact, I'm just going to call it Mix because it's. Is it called Laravel Mix? Let's have a quick look. Laravel Mix. Technically, it's called Laravel Mix. I suppose Jeffrey's probably trying to move it to just being called Mix, just to make it a little bit less Laravel specific and stop the confusion. But yeah, anyway, it probably pays just to make a note that you don't have to be using Laravel to actually use this. Do I need to add a Y? I don't know. Why maybe? Is this necessary? We can talk about that later on. And yeah, maybe give some instructions for tools like Gulp, or maybe see if people want those instructions. Minimal viable blog post, people. Yeah, let's see if people actually request Grunt and Gulp examples before we go running off there. Install. In fact, actually, maybe we can. I think Tailwind CSS docs have different language examples, so maybe we can just use those. Let's see when we get to it. Tailwind CSS. So, as said, we're just going to use yarn commands. So, run yarn add tailwind CSS. And then once we've done that, in fact, actually, let's remember to make it dev dependency. Maybe talk about why I add things as dev dependencies, or maybe save that for video tut. Don't feel like you've got to add everything to a Word document. Quite often, people, when they're reading tutorials, are more just sort of interested in the bits and pieces rather than the why. Maybe save the whys for a video. Okay, so let's have a look. Then we need to init Tailwind. Need to get command from Tailwind site. Tailwind CSS. Install. Always try and have all the information in front of you before you actually do this. Sometimes it just makes it a little bit easier. There we go. There's our command line name. It is. Let's see, what is command? So it is literally just that and file name. Now it's worth noting do you escape from that? Okay, you can call it whatever you want. Defaults to tailwind.js. I personally like calling config files tool.config.js. So in this case, tailwind.config.js, and then that's it. That is Tailwind configured and set up. Install Laravel Mix, write some npm things. Now I've got them somewhere. Here we go. Let's just copy this in a second. That's right, okay. Now we definitely want it like this, so let's just dump that in there. That's our script, so yarn run development, all our bits and pieces. Yeah, okay. Before that though, we obviously need to run yarn add not tailwind, Laravel mix dev. Write some npm scripts which are that, and then write grab the post CSS example from Tailwind site. Remember, you need to define mix as it isn't done in the example code, and it will spit an error if you do. That's something I need to speak to Adam Levin about. Also, install post CSS nested classes, nested CSS. Let's just quickly find that post CSS nested. This tool. Purely and simply because that will allow us to explain why. Nested CSS like Sass without Sass. Less. Now, I typically use Sass, but it's just, I know the typical default way that Adam recommends it is with post CSS, so let's stick with that. And then I think we will run yarn dev, and in theory this should compile successfully. Refresh the website and see if it's working. Next tutorial will be using this to show how to work with Tailwind. Don't do any of this And I think realistically, that's my plan. What is Tailwind CSS? Talk about functional, atomic, utility, because it hasn't had a name decided on it. CSS versus semantic, positives versus negatives. Keep short, less than 150 words if possible, and also provide a link to skip if people don't care already know. There is nothing worse in a tutorial than having to try and scroll through 500 words of somebody waffling at the beginning to try and find out where the actual tutorial starts. So, yeah, I think that is probably a really good starting point. So I'm going to leave it there. And I'm going to look at writing this up. Probably won't be doing it right now because I am recovering from surgery and my arm is absolutely killing me from just typing that amount. But we will see. I will post a link to the actual finished article. Hopefully, I might actually write out some of this blog post, but we'll see what happens and we'll go from there. All right. Until next time.